Thank you all for joining us at Kinship Cafe. So good to see you all this morning. And we're going to continue in the Daodejing with chapter 15. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Just want to make sure everybody's seeing that okay.
Yep.
Fantastic. All right. Well, let's just kind of jump into this. This is kind of an interesting one. And I think this is going to be a time for kind of getting some feedback from you guys as well. So it starts off with kind of setting the stage about, who the great masters of before were in terms of the Taoists. It says the great masters of ancient times focused on the indiscernible and penetrated the dark. You would never know them. So a couple of things here right off the top. One, this idea of focusing on the indiscernible. So last week we spent some time in chapter 14 talking about some of these interesting ways of trying to describe or get at this idea of wu or absence or the formlessness side of things. So this indiscernible, this is one of the things that they were focused on. And then we've also talked about how within Taoism, this idea of darkness is not a negative connotation like we have in our culture, but it had to do more with focusing on the yin aspect of the yin yang, so that there was more of this reassertion of that novelty, that newness, but also that kind of feminine approach to things, that viewing life from the perspective of that generative nature. So these would be some things that we've looked at in the past, and we can see that they're saying that the ancients were focusing on these. Okay, that makes sense. But then it says you would never know them. What do you think he's getting at with that, translating that?
Maybe like the great masters aren't bragging about penetrating the dark or something. Like you would never know they were the great masters.
Yeah, it's something that's we've heard several times earlier about the concern about status, right? And that status isn't something that you want to claim for or vie for, because it's creating two different problems. One, it's conceding to kind of a social hierarchy in which someone is above you that's able to grant you that status, which by default means that you are inferior to begin with, if just by simply accepting that idea of status. But also then this idea of the social construction of, how they're doing this hierarchy. This would definitely be something that they're not wanting to necessarily play that game. They would be thinking this is definitely at the core of what some of the problems are, especially thinking of the context, the Warring States period, this vying over prestige, this honors that are due and trying to have control and rank. They definitely would say chasing after that was problematic. So it would make sense that they're not going to be trying to show this off, that they're not going to be trying to claim those statuses or those ranks. It's kind of interesting. You would never know them. So he says, and because you wouldn't know them, I describe them with reluctance. And maybe that reluctance is that, how do you describe somebody who's not trying to make it obvious? If it was obvious, then you would notice. But there are a few things that he brings up that are kind of interesting. So, and there's going to be about 6 of these that he brings up here. So the first one, he says, they were careful. So this will be the first kind of way that they're identified, as if crossing a river in winter. So think about, I don't know if anybody here has lived in places where water freezes over and you might spend some time out on the lake or possibly a river if it freezes over. But there's a concern. Like, is it thick enough? Is it going to hold up? Is it starting to crack? So how you think about walking on that, it brings to mind a lot of things in terms of this idea of being cautious or careful, right? one of the martial arts that has a lot of influence from Taoism is Tai Chi. And I think a lot about how they do even their steps and their footwork in Tai Chi is very much like this. It's very careful. You basically, in a certain sense, you move your foot out and get it into position before you put any weight on it, which is kind of a very backwards from how we like normally walk, where you basically kind of fall onto your foot as it hits the ground. Within that movement, you're actually placing your foot first and then adding weight to it. Makes me think of this idea of trying to cross on ice. So then it says that they were cautious, as if worried about neighbors. That's kind of fun. But what do you think with these first couple here, this idea of being careful and being cautious? How do you think those are relevant to the idea of practicing Taoism?
I think it means something more about being mindful and aware of your presence type thing. Just taking in what's around you. I think that's kind of what I'm getting from it, of being careful, cautious, reserved. It means they're just you pay attention to your surroundings.
Yeah, I think also on top of what Chaz said, like not boasting about it.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
I'm getting from it like a scientist is careful about his conclusions.
Mm.
And like making sure that what they're reasoning is actually the way to go about reasoning it.
Yeah.
Almost like think before you speak.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it. Yeah, if we look at the last line here, reserved like a guest, that really kind of ties in a little bit, kind of like that cautious, as if worried about neighbors. Yeah, it definitely ties in with those same kinds of responses that you guys were talking about there. So what are some of the principles that we've thought or kind of picked up in Taoism along the way that would lead to somebody wanting to be mindful and careful and cautious?
I think about the story of the guy with the house and the water. And he keeps trying to like stop the water instead of just moving his house or out of the way. I don't know if that's relevant, but that's something that came to mind when you asked.
So what would be kind of the principle that's in play with that story? Or we could say, like, what's the point that they're trying to bring out with that story? What's the value of it?
Like, don't try to fight the flow, I guess. Like, go with the flow.
So there's the concern about the struggle of when you try to go against kind of the natural way things unfold, is going to be something where you're going to spend ever increasing amounts of energy trying to stop it from happening, like the river from flowing, that ultimately can end in a greater catastrophe than even what was happening before, when his house would get flooded when the river would overflow its banks. So rather than trying to fight against that natural process and trying to change that natural process, what should he have done?
He should have come to understand the natural process and consider that when choosing where his house is going to be.
Right. So it's this idea then of trying to understand the patterns. How do things work? And then how do we work in harmony with that overarching way so that we're not in that conflict, but we're figuring out how to work in harmony with that. And this would be then, of course, that core concept of what we mean by Tao in terms of way or patterns that we can see and observe. And so definitely one of the core principles is just what you're bringing up there is how do we act in harmony with or in conjunction with those patterns as opposed to trying to work against them or being ignorant of them. So if that's one of our core principles that we're looking at, then we can see how this careful and cautious and reserved is getting at, like Chaz was saying, this mindfulness of thinking through the actions from the perspective of how do they relate to the larger world around me. And even for people who don't get like paying attention to, these natural patterns, there's even some basic things that I think they're trying to bring up here in terms of kind of like this comparison that even somebody who's not knowledgeable about the Tao, if they're living amongst a bunch of enemies, there's going to be a way that they act because they're concerned about their neighbors, right? There's going to be a way that somebody acts just naturally about crossing a river that's frozen because, they might not know about the Tao, but this is something that's just going to happen, right? And then when you're a guest, now this might be something that's bringing in a little bit more of a social convention, but I think they're looking at this as more of a natural response that when you're a guest somewhere, you're going to be, reserved and maybe courteous. Obviously, we see people where that's not the case, right? So this could be a little bit more of a social convention that they were kind of thinking of as more of a natural way of being, or maybe a natural way that you should be or something along those lines. But this is another key point, is that there's these analogies that they see that lead to these larger principles. So in the same way that they're looking to the way that nature works in order to think about how we should work or how we should do things, they can also look at other circumstances, right? So if a person who's not even aware of the Tao is going to have a certain amount of cautiousness in the way that they carry out their activities if they're concerned about their neighbors, that's almost like another example of how they can learn about something or how they can recognize kind of this natural or spontaneous reaction, which is another key thing that the Taoists are interested in, is what is that natural behavior, that natural reaction to things. Same thing with crossing the river. So we end up with, again, things that we can look at as examples to imitate from nature or the way people interact with nature as kind of some guidelines for some core behaviors that would tie into what these masters were doing. A couple more of them here. So it says ephemeral like melting ice, simple like uncarved wood, open like a valley, and murky like a puddle. It's a fun one. So ephemeral is not a super common word, but it basically means short-lived. So you can think about that melting ice. Another way that this phrase gets translated sometimes is yielding, like melting ice. You can think about ice kind of retreating, this idea of yielding. So what about this set of character traits or ways of behaving? What do you think?
This one feels like a riddle.
This is more of a riddle?
Yeah, it feels like it.
I'm stuck on the murky like a puddle. That one's
Me
got
too,
me.
that's where it got me, yeah.
Throw me for a loop.
So let's leave that last one off for a minute because that is a little bit different. What about this idea of yielding or, not long lasting, like that idea of melting ice? What do you think could be happening there? I think it's also interesting, again, to see how they're taking some kind of natural phenomenon, right? Like this melting ice is the thing that's being compared to.
It's making sense in my head, but I can't put words to it just yet. I'm trying to figure out the right words for it.
Yeah, I think I'm a little stuck on this one too. I think this takes second place for
For
next to the
murkiness?
murky like a puddle.
So let's think about anybody have any involvement with martial arts at all?
A long time ago.
Any value that's sometimes exploited with that in terms of retreat?
Mine was more of you are defense and retreat. So it was hold your ground until you can retreat.
I,
Yeah.
I'm thinking now like knowing when to yield, like knowing your limits maybe. But ice doesn't choose when to yield, I guess, so maybe that's not it.
Well, with some of the metaphors, we have to be careful not to take it
Take
too
them too
extreme.
literally.
Yeah. Because he's not saying that we want to actually be like melting ice, but there's something interesting about ice and the fact that it melts, right? And what is kind of a concept with that in terms of it doesn't last forever. And so this is definitely kind of a key aspect of Taoism, is recognizing the impermanence of everything. Everything is constantly changing and going through different transitions. But if we're thinking about actions, then there's going to be this question about things that we're trying to make as permanent or fixed versus things that change or transition or yield. One of the things that'll come up a lot too is this idea that things that are fixed and don't change are dead. Things that move and are flexible are alive. And so there's this idea that flexibility, this yieldingness, again, if we think about the yin that's being asserted here as opposed to the yang is much more about this control, this force, this solidness, and the yin is much more about what's the word I'm looking for? Like uncharted territory, right? It's novel. There's newness. There's unexpectedness. And so I think those would be part of the things that are being brought out in this idea of the ephemeral nature, as well as the idea of yielding, when they're thinking about this particular aspect. And I just brought in the martial arts sometimes because some of the martial arts will make a lot out of that, that especially on the ones that focus on redirection, things like, judo or aikido, or even something like Tai Chi, or some of these things where they try to have a movement out of the way that actually is effective because of the momentum of the opponent. So that was maybe not the best example on my part, but where that kind of came from in terms of where my mind went. So uncarved wood, you may have heard the phrase before, uncarved block, and which is always kind of an unfortunate initial translation of this phrase, because it's almost kind of oxymoronic in the sense that a block is already carved. Right? So you can't really say uncarved block because the block is carved. There is a distinction that could be made in terms of, well, that block hasn't been made into something yet. And so it's got that possibilities that exist, but really it should just be uncarved wood, which gets back to that idea of more kind of its natural state, as opposed to kind of already moving into a fabricated state with its as a block, right? So simple, like uncarved wood. What do you think's being got at here?
Kind of like the no frills, or trying to see things as they are, not trying to I guess like elaborate them. I'm trying to think of the good word, like not be baroque.
Mm.
And instead try to get at this whole passage is kind of like explaining what reading the Tao feels like most of the time for me, but it's like,
simple.
yeah, it seems it's, the language is simple and it appears to be open, yet it is murky like a puddle when you dig rather deep into it. So, but I think like the uncarved wood is definitely like seeing that. In this sense, I feel it's like simplicity in the way that is enough.
Mm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't need to carve the wood. You can just let it be the wood, and it is enough.
Yeah. So uncarved wood would be in what kind of state?
Like the state it arose in.
Yeah. So like a natural state, right?
Yeah.
Versus carved, which we wouldn't necessarily say unnatural, because that's almost kind of an oxymoronic term in itself, but it's now attempted to be converted to something other than what it was, right? And it's not that Taoists are against this per se, because they're definitely taking advantage of things like, wheels and walking sticks and houses and that kind of thing. So it's not that they're anti-technology, but there's this concept of, if we think about this from like a social perspective, a big thing that they're trying to get at is, how do things just kind of naturally happen? How do people naturally just kind of work with each other, as opposed to what happens when they're forced into, a socially constructed way of being? That's where they're seeing the issues happening. And so I think the distinction here with that uncarved wood is that valuing of that natural state versus the contrived state, or that attempt to mold things into something other than what they were to begin with. But again, we don't want to take things too far, because they weren't anti-technology in that sense, or at least the type of technology that existed at that time, because they definitely still lived in homes and such. But there's that distinction between kind of its natural state versus being forced into something that's not its natural state. I think that would be one of the key things that's trying to be brought out here. So what about open like a valley? And we had a whole chapter that was talking about the spirit of the valley. I think it was chapter 6, I think it was.
Open-minded.
Mm.
I get it, kind of like transparency.
Mm.
And when we were talking about the valley last time, we were talking about how things flow into the valley.
So that would make the valley
lower than the mountains.
well, in terms of an attribute, it would be receptive, right? It
Yeah.
receives. Mm-hmm.
My gosh, my cat is in, then out, and then in, then out.
That's funny.
Sorry.
So with that receptivity, there's other traits that are happening then with the valley, because it receives these things. what is a consequence of the valley versus, let's say, the mountaintop?
A consequence?
Yeah.
Maybe like it's more fertile for things to grow.
Exactly. Right. Water flows down into
I would
it.
think of that as an advantage, not a consequence.
Well, consequence doesn't mean a negative. It's just like a cause and effect, right? So,
Yeah, I guess so.
yeah, I know we sometimes use consequence in a negative sense, like you're gonna have to face the consequences.
Yeah,
But,
that's how I think of it.
yeah, maybe that's a poor choice of words on my part, but yeah, the result then of the valley being open and receiving is that it's a place where life happens, right? It's like you're saying, that more of that fertility. And this is why, they kind of refer to it in feminine terms as well when they're talking about the spirit of the valley, because there's this generative nature that they're trying to get back to, of how do we recognize kind of this gift that nature is bringing to us, as opposed to being in conflict with nature. And this isn't to say that they're, obviously they experience things like, floods or earthquakes or fires or storms. It's not that they're saying that nature is always like this good, helpful place. It's saying that those evaluations of nature being negative are only when you're looking at it from the human level perspective. And one of the other key elements of Taoism is it rises above that. It's saying we want to understand the nature of just how reality functions, the cosmos, how does it function, not necessarily just from what's good for humans. And when you look at it from that higher perspective, those things, again, are kind of natural consequences of various patterns of how earth and weather and nature and all that kind of stuff functions. And so we can't really assign them like a good or a bad type of a value. It just is, right? It's not, there's no intention behind it. It's not trying to hurt anybody. It's just doing what it does. So within human perspective, the more we can recognize that, we can try to figure out, how do we work with it? How do we recognize the patterns? How do we find ways to help or participate in those patterns so that they're more beneficial, let's say, to us, right? So we could think, if we take it into more of a modern day context where we're concerned about things like pollution or possibly the issues of climate change, in what ways can we recognize the natural patterns of things and where we've interrupted those patterns of things, and try to mitigate those consequences by trying to remediate or get back to or become more regenerative in how we're approaching our place in this larger environment that we find ourselves. So there's a lot that's interesting with this idea of recognizing nature as kind of like that teacher, but not trying to say that everything is good in that sense, because that's more of a value statement that applies at the human level of things, especially in terms of intention. But in terms of their concern is, how do we recognize those patterns so we can work with them? Which is a big distinction. There's a thing out there called the naturalistic fallacy that says basically if it's natural, it's good, kind of an idea. And a lot of philosophical systems will push back against that and say, yeah, well, how can you say that when there's things like, hurricanes and tsunamis? And it's not what they're saying here within this Taoist perspective. They're saying that there's patterns for the way everything functions, and it's not a value judgment of good or bad. It's, how do we recognize those so we can work in harmony with them? Working in harmony with that, they would argue, is a good, because that's going to allow for the greatest flourishing of human experience of life. So then we've got this murky like a puddle. And the concept that's being brought up here in more of a little literal term is sediments stirred up within water, right? So you can't see through it. So it's murky, in this case, like a puddle. We've kind of talked about most of these things, this seems to be kind of out of characteristic. Why does it feel out of characteristic, do you think? Or what makes it feel out of characteristic to you?
The other things seem like good qualities of nice things.
Yeah.
And murky kind of seems like a bad thing. I don't know. But I guess I could see, I don't know. It seems like it's just not the greatest thing to try to be. Usually
Yeah.
you want things to be clear and
Yeah, like
not murky.
simple and open seem like opposites of murky.
Yeah.
Does it
Yeah, I
sound
was
like
getting this. I was getting the same thing of like, if you think about a murky puddle, you usually see dirty, dark water, and there's little things like floating in it, and it's usually really gross. And most people
Yeah.
think of that, and you're like, I don't want to be like a murky puddle because that's
Yeah.
gross, and then you can't see in it and all that stuff. So that's what kind
Yeah,
of
if it
threw me
said
for a loop.
like fun, like dancing in the rain or something, or puddle jumping, maybe it would be different. But murky like a puddle, yeah, I'm having a hard time with that one.
well, think about the very opening of this chapter. What did it say about the masters?
That they
It'll be-
penetrate the darkness.
Trying to be discreet, unseen.
Yeah, you couldn't
And
recognize
this
it.
murkiness helps you hide. If you're a frog, you like it to be murky.
Yeah, right. So it's kind of that interesting aspect. It's like, yeah, there's all these things, and then somehow there's this idea of not wanting to necessarily stand out or be obvious or drawing attention, which is kind of it kind of throws you a little bit for a loop. It's like, oh, this is an interesting one, but then it's like, oh yeah, it kind of ties in with what they were saying at the beginning, that they're not doing this for like status and fame and accord, that they're practicing these things in terms of trying to live in within these natural patterns, but not for the benefit of trying to be recognized in some way. And so that's kind of this, maybe the tweak that feels so unusual to us, because so much of how our culture is structured is, advancement, and how do we stand out, and how do we shine, and how do we stand out
Go to the next
against the
level.
rest. Hmm?
Like getting to the next level, constant growth and recognition and titles and
Yeah. So for us, that idea of not that invisibility kind of, right, just becoming kind of blending into the background seems kind of odd, but it would definitely be something that was more of a key concept in this case. All right.
makes sense now.
That's kind of interesting, huh? So those are the attributes, and he kind of drops out of that, and he's like, okay, but those that can be like a puddle become clear when they're still. So again, if we think about the sediment being stirred up in the water, but if you're able to be still long enough, it kind of settles back down, right? And the water becomes clear again. But that requires a whole nother set of attributes, right? Like the ability to be still, to not be constantly chasing after things, to actually just stop and reflect or breathe, or, being mindful or doing the meditation. And conversely, says those that can be at rest become alive when they're roused. So there's this idea of like adaptability, right? So there's the ability to be calm when they need to be, and it can bring clarity because they stop and they wait for the dust to settle and they can observe, which is again that key thing. How do we get those filters off of our eyes so that we can actually see more clearly what is, as opposed to what we want to be? but there's also that ability to move into action when needed too, right? So we got kind of both sides of this that are working. Before I move on to the next part of this, any thoughts on this section? All right.
Yeah, this one actually makes sense to me.
Not as complicated here.
Yeah.
All right. So then he kind of concludes with those who treasure this way. And this is a different translation or translator we're using this time, Red Pine. Way that's in capital here is again our word Tao. So those who treasure this Tao or this way don't try to be seen. So we've kind of seen that already with the murky water or murky puddle, and we saw it with the opening that you wouldn't recognize them out in the world. Not trying to be seen, they can hide and stay hidden. I think we kind of talked a bit about why that would be important or how that plays into the overall Taoist strategy in terms of playing that social hierarchy game, right? And how they opt out of that particular strategy. So this is the whole of that chapter. I have one other point that I want to bring up with this that isn't necessarily directly part of the chapter, but before I get to that, any thoughts or overall impressions now that we kind of went through the whole chapter?
They just seem very sneaky, these ancient ones.
Yeah.
Subtle.
They're probably still among us.
Exactly. You would never know. Yeah, and I will say this chapter has one of the more interesting translation challenges. There's a lot of different ways this one comes across, and I after going through and reading a number of them, I think I have something like 30 some different translations that I go through for each of these, plus looking at the different commentaries and such on them, that I found that this seemed to kind of tie in the best of the ones that I was finding. But there's so many different ways that this chapter was translated, including this last part here. It's definitely a confusing chapter in some respects, but I think at the core, what it's trying to get at, where all of them were kind of on the same page, is that they were lifting up these ancient masters as an example in the same way that they were holding up these different natural processes as examples in order to be something to emulate or to follow. And they all had the basic characteristics, and all the basic characteristics were essentially the same. Where it really differed somewhat in the previous statement about being calm and being roused, but mostly in this last one about what it means for those that treasure this way. And some of them, I don't have them in front of me, but some of them would get into more of this idea that they don't seek excess. And because they don't seek excess, they can be used. And that's an interesting concept as well. And some of them would kind of tie it into that being overfilled. So we talked about, not filling the cup to the brim. In a previous one, that kind of comes back around in some of the different ways this last part is being translated, is that because they're not overfilled, they're still useful. They can still do something. And then there's this one about being covered that we're seeing here. And one of the other ways that kind of got translated was I can't remember all the different ways now, but there are some real struggles with this. And I think part of it was also some textual criticism, in that there's a standard text of the Daodejing that has been around for quite a while, but it's relatively late in terms of when it was copied down. And they've found earlier versions of this And in most respects of the Daodejing, they match up. Some of the things are a bit different in terms of especially the ordering. So in the way that we normally read the Tao Te Ching right now, it's the Daodejing, and it's the first 38 chapters are dealing with, or 37 are dealing with the Tao predominantly. It starts off with that, and we've got chapters 1 through 37. Then starting with 38, there's kind of a big emphasis on Da, and the final part of the book is considered like the Da part, where it's focusing on that aspect. In some of the ancient manuscripts, these are reversed. So it starts with chapter 38, what we call chapter 38, and goes all the way up to the 81, which is the last one. And then it starts with chapter 1 and continues. That would be one of the big fundamental differences between some of these other versions. And then there's subtle text changes and subtle variations in the words that are being used. And this is going to be common with lots of texts from antiquity because they're copied, by hand. And sometimes there's things where copyists are thinking this doesn't make sense, and so they're adding in different words that change things, or they have a particular way of looking at it that they think is more appropriate. And so sometimes changes enter in that way. Sometimes things get lost, or meanings because of time changes get lost, and they try to find ways to bring that out in different ways. So there's different ways that these variations creep into a text over time. And I think that had a lot to do with how this last section was really looked at in a couple of different ways. But Red Pine's a very well-respected translator, and he lays out a lot of his reasons for selecting the particular variations of the text that he did. So if you're interested in checking that out, that would be a good place to start. So in the remaining time, I had kind of an interesting thought I wanted to pursue, which is why the legendary status of ancient masters? What's the point of that? Why doesn't he just say, hey, the guys that got this down right now are like this? Why does he bring up ancient masters? And why were
Is the
they?
term Taoist not a thing, I guess? Yeah, like why wouldn't he just call them like Taoists or?
Well, there could be that, in terms of the title. But if this is kind of a newer way of talking about this way of being, because I would argue that Taoism is either representing or a preservation of an older, kind of more Paleolithic, or what we might call indigenous worldview. But they might not have actually referred to themselves as Taoist, and definitely in the past might not have referred to themselves in that concept. So that could be there. But why are the ancient masters legendary? Why are they different than the masters of the time that this is being written, or for us today? What's the benefit of calling this out?
So I'm kind of wondering if ancient masters is supposed to be a person, because it sounds like they're trying to say it's not people necessarily, but masters in nature that have handled this, and of course do it naturally. So I'm kind of wondering if it's more pointed towards like the ancient masters of the natural world, of like they say, be still like a tree because they're the master at it,
I think they're still talking about people here. And this isn't something unique to the Tao Te Ching. I mean, if you look at almost any of the faith traditions that I'm aware of, at least, they're always looking back, right, to when things were more perfect, right, to people who were exceptional in different ways, whether it's looking back to the saints or to the Buddhas or to whoever the different exemplars are. Isn't there always kind of like this movement that you notice when they're trying to really get at something, and somehow these ancient masters are more intelligent than us, even though they had less access to information than we do today. And they sometimes seem like they almost have like supernatural kind of powers in a lot of these stories, not necessarily this one, but in some other ones. Why? What do you think from a sociological perspective? What is the reason that so many of these traditions resort to talking about people from the past who really got it, who were really good at it, and because they were really good at it, they had some kind of special powers? What do you think's behind that?
Is it like a way to back up your argument without having direct evidence? But you're saying, oh, these people, I see this argument a lot in like diets. They're like, ancient man used to do this. And so that's how we were evolved, and that is absolutely how
It's
we should live,
tradition.
because so it's kind of like, this is how I'm proving the argument that I'm laying out.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, for me, it's like, you think of how many lessons are taught through stories and like anecdotes of people in certain roles experiencing certain challenges and how they overcome it. And I'm thinking, oh, if they want to tell us that there were these ancient masters that were so good because they did X, Y, and Z, and they were like the puddle and they were like the blackwood, like that gives you something to try to put yourself into those shoes and try to aspire to become that character, that person in that role, facing that challenge and using that solution.
Yeah. So it's being used as a way to inspire current behavior, right? Because wouldn't you want to be like the ancient masters? And it's like Dwayne was saying, it becomes kind of a legitimization strategy. Like, yeah, this stuff was great. The reason we're in the problems we have now is because it's become bastardized, right? It's become diluted, or in some way they have forgotten these ancient truths that we need to recapture. And a lot of different traditions take advantage of this idea. There's something about antiquity that tends to lend credence to the way we think about things. If it's old, it kind of just comes with this idea that there must be something to it. If it's been around for this long, there must be something to it. And of course, none of that's necessarily true, right? It's like, just because something's old doesn't mean it was right. There's a lot of ideas.
In fact, a lot of the opposite is true a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we look back at stuff that's older, and oftentimes we're like, whew, glad we don't have those ideas anymore. Glad we don't, tie people out on the stake and break them on the wheel or crucify them and that kind of stuff, public executions. Yeah. Glad we're not doing that anymore. Or, even the concepts of like slavery or misogyny or any of these things that were like, yeah, not good. So when we resort to the legitimization based on antiquity, I think sometimes the reason that happens is because we have a challenge demonstrating its value in the present, right? Or maybe it doesn't have as much weight. Maybe we can point to my friend John, who's I'm just making up somebody right now, and say, yeah, John's a Taoist master. Check him out. You can't tell, because they keep it hidden. But it's a good thing. You should try it. It just doesn't have the same kind of weight or kind of the mystique or intrigue as, look at these
An ancient master.
They were legendary, right? But I think,
but you could also, sorry to interrupt you, but you could also bring in the fact of time, because they are locked in the past. So there's nothing in the future that can make them infallible. So
Well,
if you have a master of today who's currently living, they could mess up tomorrow, and all of a sudden they could be the worst person in the entire planet tomorrow because they did something wrong.
yeah.
So that no longer makes them a master. So that the people, the ancients of yesterday, don't have to contend with the future, because, and then that also kind of, again, time kind of takes place of, even if they did do wrong by accident, time seems to forget that in many cases.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily an accurate representation, right? But nobody can argue with it because the person's not here. You can't bring them up, you know. So
Yeah, they don't even really have names. It's just ancient masters,
yeah, right. And let's say, John has some kind of failure. Well, that also can be something that is much more about reality and something that we actually have to deal with, and maybe something that we can actually relate with better because we fail all the time, right? So there's different ways that it can be approached, but there's kind of this, I think, temptation to go this route in order to have the ability to legitimize what you're trying to sell, so to speak, in terms of the ideas. And I think that the problem with this one, besides making it something that's not very approachable, when we put people up on these pedestals and give them this unrealistic values of how they achieved things, it becomes something that we can't actually do ever, right? Because we're never going to be able to perform in the way that these legendary figures did, which is problematic. But I think the other thing that this unwittingly did by inserting something as simple as this into the text is it paved the way for what becomes religious Taoism. And it starts to maybe bring in some of the same type of characteristics that get used within different types of religious traditions of the sanctified past or the more perfect past, that then becomes kind of this basis where things that are improbable, different kinds of miracles. It's like, well, why don't these miracles happen today? Well, they were different back then, right? Times were different, people were different, and there's no way to like kind of argue with those things. But it allows certain kinds of ideas to creep into the tradition that are very different. And I know there's a lot of movement right now to really stop having a distinction between what we would commonly refer to as philosophical Taoism versus religious Taoism. But at least for my 2 cents, what I see in the Daodejing and mostly in Zhuangzi, which is the other kind of core of the classical period teachings from Taoism, is so radically different than what happens later on as it moves into what is more fully recognized as religious Taoism, that there had to be a transition, there had to be an evolution, or I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing because I'm not anti-religious, but there definitely is a difference. And how do we account for those differences? I think that part of what happens, how something like this idea that there's because within religious Taoism, there's definitely this pursuit of immortality, not as like an ethereal spirit being, but as a physical human being. And this led them into having these ideas that there were these ancient masters who did live extraordinary periods of time, right? Well, how is that even possible? Well, it's legendary, right? It's in the past, it's ancient, it's a forgotten secret that we need to bring back around. And they started working with these different elixirs to try and help bring about this immortality. And from what I understand, a main component in a lot of them was mercury, which is obviously not good for living long. But
It sounds like they're working against the way of nature by trying to live longer.
well, yeah, and that's a whole nother point that gets kind of interesting, right? Like, how does this actually tie in with all the other aspects? There's definitely philosophical shifts that happen once you move into that perspective. And I think, just my opinion, that's part of how you get there is by the seemingly innocent process that we saw here of attributing kind of extraordinary abilities to the people of the past and lifting those up as examples. And yes,
They're giving them status, yet they're saying status shouldn't be a thing.
well, there's that too, right? Like the status. So it's kind of a, I guess, a human nature to try and look to the past for legitimization of the present. And there's some good reasons for looking at that. What has worked in the past is maybe a good predictor of what's going to work in the present. But it also has traps. And I think one of those traps is that it can lead to more of this religious idolization of the past. Just some thoughts, some musings on that I just thought I'd share. I know we're
Interesting.
kind of at time, but I think we'll just have to kind of leave it there for right now. And I just want to say, if you're watching this and you'd like to join us for our discussions in the future, you can go to www.kinship.cafe and register your email, and you'll get the links for this Zoom conversation that happens on Friday mornings. And there's also a live offering of the class that happens on Sunday mornings if you happen to be in the Southern California area. So again, thanks everybody for coming, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks.